I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. As the Prime Minister says, the COVID pandemic has been the most significant global crisis we've faced in decades. Yet he's opted for an inquiry that won't look into some of the most contentious decisions of the states and territories, including lockdowns and school closures. Peter Dutton is outraged. Indeed, there's concern across the political spectrum, from Greens to independents. The government reckons most Australians just want to move on. But learning lessons from each crisis is important. The Royal Commission into the Black Summer bushfires made a raft of recommendations. Most have now been implemented. They're aimed at better preparing Australia for the next dangerous bushfire season, which, after the past week, many fear is already upon us. Later in the program, I'll speak with the Emergency Management Minister, Murray Watt, about the coming fire season. But first, to the panel, Samantha Maiden, Peter Hartcher and Dana Morse. Look, let's just start on the bushfire preparedness. A lot of the temperatures, I think, Sam, this week created a fair bit of anxiety when it was so hot. The El Nino declaration may not have been a surprise, but for those who remember the Black Summer fires, there's worry out there. Is it clear authorities are prepared for this season?
I think that they're more prepared than they were last time around, and it's interesting that they're having this debate about whether or not they should bring in the army, because that was obviously the big flex that Scott Morrison always engaged in. And I think people find that quite comforting. I was, what's the right word to say? I noted Neil James's contribution to this debate, who said that...
He's from the Australia Defence Association.
Yeah, and he said that, like, there's all these people who are, quote unquote, bitching and moaning when the smoke comes into force, but they're not prepared to do anything. People in New South Wales are expecting, you know, the Army Reserves from Queensland to come down and suggested so there should be some sort of, volunteer army of firefighters. I mean, look, I still think that, no, you shouldn't expect the Defence Department to do everything, but you know, if they can help, why wouldn't they?
It's an interesting one, and we'll explore this with the Minister shortly, Dana, because the view, certainly of the Defence Strategic Review, was we rely on Defence too much in natural disasters. This is not sustainable. Defence need to be getting on with the things that Defence needs to do. And yet you've got a problem with a lot of volunteers for SES and bushfire brigades. They're dropping. So what do you do?
It was really interesting. I thought last week maybe on Q&A there were a couple of CFS or RFS volunteers in the audience, and they said that even though that we had this Royal Commission, these recommendations in large have been actioned and we're in a better position, they're in a worse position because so many of their volunteers are older now. Yeah. They don't have that experience on the ground fighting fires. So really this is a problem for those rural and country fire services to start recruiting people who want to step up and help during these times of crisis.
Yeah, and again, we'll talk to Murray Watt about that in a tick, because this is the challenge. A lot of small towns, young folk are leaving, the drift to the cities, Peter. It means you've got fewer people learning how to work the fire truck and help out when the fire comes. But something's got to give on this.
Yeah, so volunteer numbers are down, and as you say, the Defence Strategic Review said flat out that the Defence Force has to withdraw from emergency management as a routine thing. So,
not altogether, but just as as you say, as a routine.
Yeah, and not to expect the ADF to be available to come in and help with every crisis. And at the same time, we know that the background level of climate change is continuing and accelerating and will be for at least another 20 years, even if we manage to somehow limit temperature growth. So what does this mean? I think it means that Australia is going to have to get used to the idea. It's going to have to gear up to a new level and actually allocate a lot more money to fire services in the states, and maybe there's a federal response involved as well. But it's going to cost money, and that may involve more taxing. I know you're not allowed to say that in Australian politics, but this is the beginning of a new phase of worse fires, where I think all the indications are that we need a broader systemic response.
And particularly if they go for longer as well, because this is a debate that came up during the last fires, is that people were being called up to volunteer, sometimes for weeks and an end. People that have jobs, the small business people, that have to basically cover the cost of that. And that's always going to be a debate as well about paying volunteers.
Is this one of the situations, though, where we should be looking to AI and technology to take some jobs? Like, there are some really interesting pathways around creating satellite networks that monitor for fires, because I was really surprised to find out that the majority of fires are still reported by phone calls by people. So that means that they could be raging in the bush for a long time before anybody even knows about them. So there's a lot of plans, none that have gotten up yet, but to create some sort of network of satellites to be able to survey the country and see when these fires break out. And that would reduce the need on these volunteers in the first place, because there'd be a more comprehensive map.
You're dead right, Dana. And I've seen that there's a proprietary software that already exists using existing satellites. I've seen it demonstrated in the US. So it's just a matter of buying it.
Right, comes down to money. As you were saying, you mentioned climate change, Peter. I want to turn to this because it's been an interesting week on both sides of politics. For the government, they remain committed to their targets: 82% renewables by 2030, and then net zero by 2050, of course. But that requires building a lot of renewables, and we're seeing increasing pushback from some communities, particularly in the Hunter, where there's a huge offshore wind farm planned. Chris Bowen was up there during the week, and we saw in the package there some of the community upset about that. The Prime Minister went there as well.
There are at least another 3 points in the cycle in which people will have the opportunity to put their views. The fact that Chris Bowen was there consulting people says about my government's approach. We consult, we work with communities to make sure that we get that support.
Is it getting harder, Sam, though, to get that community support?
I really like that quote in the package from that guy who said, "We are really in favour of renewables, but not here."
But, yeah.
Somewhere else. Look, I think it's just always tricky, isn't it? Because when a controversial project like that comes into frame, you can say all the things you like about the support, but when it's in your backyard, the NIMBYism does rise to the surface. It does have a sort of space age feel to it, doesn't it? Like, cause when you drive around in the country near Canberra, they have a lot of
lots of wind farms. Yeah,
and you do feel like you're in a bit of a sci-fi film. I suppose if they were rising from the ocean, but
these offshore wind farms. I mean, you go to Europe, Peter, and they're everywhere. This is pretty critical to the plan, isn't it, to get to 82% renewables?
Yeah. So there's community resistance emerging in a lot of places at the same time. So the government has made some concessions on that one. They've made it smaller.
They've reduced it, haven't they?
Yeah, made it smaller, pushed it further offshore, and so on. But this is old stuff. It's a new focus on an old subject, which is managing community dissent and winning community support. Their politicians, the people who lead these governments, surely they can muster some old-fashioned politics and work with locals, have better consultation, be more respectful, maybe make more changes, maybe offer compensation. I don't know.
There's only so much
These
you
are
can
all
do,
old tools.
Yeah, like putting the lines underground is hugely expensive in a lot of parts, so that's not going to be an option. And they're not getting any help, funnily enough, from the other side. The opposition reckon we're going too gung-ho with renewables. They want to go nuclear instead. So what happened this week, Labor really trying to goad the Liberals, I guess, or flush them out in terms of what their plans are here by putting on the table this cost figure, $387 billion they reckon it would cost to replace the current coal fleet with small modular nuclear reactors. Now, the opposition might reject that figure, but the question is, what will they do? What are their plans? They say they do have a plan, or they will have a plan. Ted O'Brien, the Shadow Minister, was on Q&A on Monday night. Surely you must have an idea what the cost is if you're committing to this.
Yes, we do.
And
but I'm not going to preempt a
It's a secret, is it?
But here's the thing. It is. Until we release our policy, David, I'm not going to get the specifics.
Yeah, fair enough. They'll release it closer to the election, but will it be a detailed plan? Will it say how many reactors, what the cost is? Sam, what do you think?
I don't know, I doubt it. But I mean, look, the danger with all of this stuff is always that I think that the coalition is right to say that the Labor Party should not dismiss these options out of hand. But I'm not sure about the effectiveness of these stories that Chris Bowen's putting out about figures, because they've been immediately sort of torn apart. if he really thinks that the market is not interested in the idea, he
Leave
should
it to the market.
leave it to the market, right?
Which raises the question,
Get rid of the ban. And
why do we have the ban still? Dana, is there a need for this ban on nuclear power still?
Well, if you're the Labor Party, yes, there is. They have traditionally been very anti-nuclear. Interestingly enough, we now have nuclear submarines, so they're having to walk that back a little bit, but historically Labor has been proudly and vocally anti-nuclear. Their whole positioning around this to bring up the figures shows what they think is scarier for Australians right now, and it's not the threat of a nuclear situation. It's in a cost of living crisis, nearly $400 billion on nuclear power.
See, that's what
Should
I
be
agree. I
frightening.
think that's what I find really interesting, that Labor's argument against nuclear, Peter, has shifted really into the cost issue more so than safety.
Yeah, and the small nuclear reactors, the modular reactors that the Liberals are talking about, are a safer option insofar as we know, although the industry is still in a small scale. It's still a nascent industry. It's not yet deployed to scale. The Bowen cost estimates are unrealistic. They include unrealistic assumptions, so they're not reliable. But the Liberal position, the Liberal policy is also unrealistic because who's going to build the things? Unless the Liberals are proposing that the federal government own and operate these reactors, you are not going to get the private sector either building large-scale traditional nuclear power plants, which would cost upwards of $20 billion, and we'd be talking 5 to 10 years to build one, nor are you going to get the private sector investing in the small nuclear reactors, because as long as it's politically partisan, as long as the Labor Party is opposed, no investor is going to put money into these. It's a Potemkin policy, David, by which I mean it's got a political facade, but behind it, it's an empty policy.
Presumably the cost of these things comes down over time though, right? These small modular reactors, as you know, plenty of countries are putting money into them, but they all have, most of them have more advanced nuclear regimes. We don't have a...
No, I mean, we like digging it up and selling it to other people to do things with it.
Anyway, I'm sure this debate will return to in the lead up to the next election. Time though now to talk to the Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management, Murray Watt. To take us there, here were some of his own Labor colleagues expressing concern about preparations ahead of this bushfire season.
There is a feeling that we haven't progressed land management substantially since the Black Summer bushfires, and I think that will be a concern to a number of people. We had a New South Wales bushfire inquiry that took place after 2019-2020, and there should have been more work to make sure that we were dealing with those recommendations, and that doesn't come down to the last couple of months. That's the last 3 years that we should have been preparing.
When we consider the amount of rain we've had over the last 2 years, where effectively it's rained every second day, that's made hazard reduction really difficult. We had some planned hazard reductions for even as early as a couple of months ago that we had to change. But I'm not going to sugarcoat it. We're not where we want to be.
Murray Watt, welcome to the program.
G'day, David. Good to be with you.
So we saw your New South Wales counterpart there expressing some concern that we're not where we need to be with hazard reduction burns. Do you share that concern?
Look, I can completely understand Christy McBain reflecting the concerns of her local community. Her electorate was one of the most worst affected through the Black Summer bushfires, and I don't think it's any surprise that there's a high level of anxiety in communities like that as we head into another bushfire season. But what I can assure your viewers is that Australia is much better prepared for this coming season than we were heading into Black Summer. We have implemented almost all of the recommendations of the Bushfire Royal Commission that were made to the federal government. They include establishing one coordinated national emergency management agency rather than two separate organisations under two separate ministers, which existed before. We will actually have more aircraft available for firefighting than we've ever had in this country, including one extra large water bombing aircraft and plenty more helicopters than we've had before. And I know that the states have done everything they can when it comes to hazard reduction, given the incredibly wet circumstances that we've been in over the last couple of years. I remember it was only a couple of months ago I was in rural Victoria meeting with volunteer firefighters, and they were telling me how difficult it had been to undertake hazard reduction, because whenever they went out there, their shoes and boots were literally sinking in the mud. So it has been challenging to be ready on that front, but I know that the New South Wales government has been throwing extra resources at this over the last couple of months to catch up and be as ready as possible. And I read this morning, in fact, that New South Wales is preparing to do more hazard reduction burns even this weekend, now that those temperatures have come down and it's more safe to do so.
But Christy McBain doesn't seem to share that view that they've done all they can at the state level with hazard reduction. I mean, her comments during the week were that there's frustration, land management is still not a priority, and there hasn't been enough investment by the states in the paid workforce to do this job.
Well, obviously, when it comes to hazard reduction, that is something that is the responsibility of states and territories.
Have they done enough?
But I do know that I think different states have done more than others. My understanding is that Queensland, for instance, has actually... Well, my understanding is that Queensland has reached its targets for fuel reduction heading into this summer, but states like New South Wales and Victoria, where we have had incredibly heavy flooding over the last year or so, it has been more difficult. I think if you look at Christie's comments, what she was more reflecting on is the activity that didn't take place under the former New South Wales government, and she made the point that she's not just talking about the last few months, but one other thing that's going to be different heading into this bushfire season is that you're seeing a lot more cooperation between federal, state and territory governments, and we're not going to be engaging in what we saw under the former government of finger pointing and blame shifting. We're working very cooperatively, and that's how we get the country prepared.
Right, to that end, this summit, you're going to be taking part in it over the next couple of days in Canberra. Just tell us a bit about this National Bushfire Summit. What are you hoping to achieve?
Yeah, well, this, David, is the next step in the Albanese government's plan to make sure that we're much better prepared for disasters than we ever have been in the past. It's something we've been working on very hard since coming to office, and this is the next step. So over the next 2 days in Canberra, we're bringing together about 200 or 300 leaders from the fire authorities, from all of the state and territory jurisdictions, in addition to our own people. But importantly, we're also inviting leaders from the community sector and the private sector to really bring them into the picture as well, about what sort of situation we're facing this year, to make sure that the entire community is prepared. Obviously, when we face bushfires or any other form of natural disaster, it's our fire authorities or our disaster authorities who are on the front line, but the community sector play an incredibly important role in recovery, providing relief to people, and also the private sector need to get involved when you have supply chains interrupted and things like that we've seen in the past. So there's been a huge amount of work over the last few months between federal, state and territory authorities to be ready. But what's different about this is, for the first time, we're also bringing together people from outside government so that we'll all have a shared understanding of what we're facing. And the Prime Minister will be speaking at it, I'll be speaking at it. The second day will include a literal scenario test outlining a possible situation that might occur this year to put everyone through their paces. And we'd rather find any gaps that might exist in the system before we get to this summer, rather than learn about them when they're actually happening.
You mentioned the aerial firefighting resources. We've got more than ever, I think you said. One of the recommendations of the Royal Commission, though, was for an Australian-based and registered aerial firefighting capability. Where are we up to with having that sovereign capability, or are we still having to hire these things?
Well, I think what I've found is that when you speak to different people in the fire community, different people have different interpretations of what a sovereign aerial firefighting capability means. Some would argue that we already have that because already about 95% of the aerial fleet that we use, whether it be those big air tankers, helicopters or smaller planes, about 95% of them are actually based in Australia all year round anyway. As I say, we now have one more large water bombing plane than we had back in Black Summer. A couple of the states have also taken on their own as well. But I think the reality is that as we do face longer fire seasons, both here in Australia and overseas, we do need to be thinking about whether we'll have access to the planes and other aircraft that we need in the future. But what I can tell you is that all of the state authorities have assured us that the capacity that they have online for this year is going to be enough to deal with this year. As I say, we will have about 500 aircraft overall nationally available for this fire season, which is more than Australia has ever had before. And at the federal level, we've actually doubled the funding for aerial firefighting compared to what existed at the federal level back in Black Summer. So, you know, as you said in the introduction, David, no one can guarantee that we won't be facing risk. There will always be risk in a country like Australia, but we're certainly doing everything we possibly can to be prepared.
I want to ask you about this reliance on defence. We know the Defence Strategic Review is concerned. It's unsustainable the way we keep using defence as much as we do in natural disasters. In opposition, just before the election, you were sharply critical of the lack of defence resources during those floods in northern New South Wales. What's your view now? What's the answer to getting this balance right?
Yeah, well, I think what we need to do is, as the Defence Strategic Review identified, is recognise that the Defence Force are under immense pressure themselves. We do live in a more uncertain strategic world than we have in the past, and it's important that the ADF can be focused on their core mission, which is the defence of the nation. And the reality is that every time we do call on the Defence Forces to assist in a disaster situation, that is taking them away from their training and their preparedness for their core duty. But I want to be clear with people that the Albanese government will always make the Defence Forces available when they're needed, but what we need to do is recognise that they should be used as a last resort rather than a first port of call. I think in a situation like we faced in Lismore and the Northern Rivers of New South Wales, there is no doubt that you would need the ADF deployed for that kind of thing. And in the recent floods in the Kimberley, we were bringing people across from Townsville, aircraft in Townsville, and I know they found that essential. But it's about getting the balance right and making sure that we are not overly relying on them. And that's why, for example, we're investing in a group called Disaster Relief Australia. We're providing them $38 million over the next few years. They're a veteran-based volunteer organisation that I've seen in the field doing fantastic work to help with clean-up, help with recovery. So we need to be finding other solutions rather than only turning to the ADF.
Just on those other solutions, using veterans as volunteers, no doubt is one of them. But I know the Home Affairs Department has a discussion paper on this, trying to get a bit of creative thinking. You've also suggested in the past ideas around maybe a semi-professional firefighting service. What's your current thinking, Murray Watt, on how we deal with the fact that we can't rely on defence as much as we have? Climate change means we're going to have more and more intense events like this. There are fewer volunteers with all the SES and bushfire brigades and so on. So what do we need to be thinking about here?
Well, as you've outlined, David, it's a very challenging environment that we are facing in coming years because of all of those factors coming together. As you've said, the Department of Home Affairs is currently undertaking a big piece of policy work to really establish what we will need at the federal level in the future to be able to respond to disasters in a personnel sense and an equipment sense. That work will carry into the new year, and I don't want to preempt those recommendations. But as I say, we're taking short-term steps in the meantime by investing in those kind of groups like Disaster Relief Australia. But it is possible that in the future we're going to need to be turning to sort of semi-professional firefighting services, which is what they have in places like California, where people can come online and be paid for their services for longer periods of the year, sort of just for the fire season rather than an entire year. There are all those sort of options that are under consideration at the moment.
What about, would we ever get to the point where we have to look at some sort of national community service where people up to a certain age perhaps have to do a certain number of hours, be it with the SES or the Rural Fire Service, to ensure that the boots are there on the ground?
Again, that sort of option is under consideration through this review process that we've got underway at the moment, and that sort of thing I know has been suggested to people. I think that there probably are young people out there who'd be more interested in providing that kind of community service than they might be for enlisting in the Army Reserves or things like that. I think we should be thinking about all options about how we meet our future needs.
So you're open to that idea of actually obliging people, requiring young people to do that sort of service?
Well, I wouldn't want to commit to sort of obliging people or forcing them to do so. It might be possible to do it in a voluntary manner, such as what we have with the Army Reserve at the moment. We don't force people to join the Army Reserve, but there's a lot of people who want to choose that option. And similarly, there might be people open to this as well. I think there's a range of different options that we need to consider. It might also be about supporting the states and territories with building up their numbers of volunteers, because I think we do need to be cautious about having the federal government overstep its area of responsibility. This is an area that is primarily led by states and territories. We don't want to duplicate services that they have in place. But the fact is we are facing a difficult changing climate, and we need to be ready and we need to think differently.
What about the personnel? You mentioned that. A lot of them suffered a lot of mental health PTSD after the Black Summer fires. Maybe that's one of the reasons why volunteer numbers are down. Federal government does fund some of the mental health supports here. I was talking to Fortum the other day, one of the groups that tries to help prevent worse problems happening with mental health amongst volunteers. They have to scramble each year for funding, though. Shouldn't this be a core part of bushfire readiness, looking after the mental well-being of those volunteers?
There's no doubt that we need to be supporting the mental health needs of our volunteers and our paid personnel. They go through some incredibly traumatic situations, and I've spoken to many of them in the field about what they've gone through, and that is why we are providing funding to organisations like Fordham, the Black Dog Institute, Phoenix, a number of others as well. Just recently, the Assistant Mental Health Minister, Emma McBride, and I released a new framework, mental health framework, for how we support our volunteers. So these are, again, all ideas that we have under consideration and we're acting on at the moment.
A couple of other things, Minister. Clearly the Royal Commission into natural disasters, into the bushfires, was a worthwhile exercise. All of the states signed letters patent to be a part of it. Why isn't there going to be a Royal Commission into the COVID pandemic?
Well, for starters, there was never a commitment made to have a Royal Commission. The commitment made was to have an independent inquiry, and that's what we've established. And really what the government is about trying to understand the lessons from the past rather than trying to engage in political point scoring. I mean, typically Royal Commissions have been used for areas where you've had maladministration, potential corruption, potential criminal referrals, such as the Robodebt Royal Commission that's happened recently.
Well, not with the bushfire Royal Commission. That was about trying to look at a crisis and work out how to better handle the next one.
Yeah, but I think the issue is that because we did have every state operating differently in this through COVID, David, I think it would be just impractical to be able to have a Royal Commission that looks into every decision of every state government.
Why?
You'd really end up needing to have you'd have to have 8 separate Royal Commissions to look into the activities of 8 separate jurisdictions. I mean, I'm talking to you from Coolangatta, just near the New South Wales-Queensland border. New South Wales and Queensland operated differently on different ways, whether it be about border closures, school closures. We'd have a long-running inquiry that would never end if it was looking into every single decision.
So can you just clear that up for us? It won't
that every jurisdiction made.
Okay, so this inquiry won't look at school closures?
No. Well, what Mark Butler said last week was that one of the terms of reference for the inquiry is the public health responses that were undertaken. We've also said that the different responsibilities of the federal government and the states will be within scope.
But what does that mean? Will it look at school
made
closures? Just back to the question. Will it look at school closures?
Well, that obviously that will ultimately be a matter for the inquiry, and it's headed by 3 independent experts who are capable of making that decision.
So they can look at it, or they're not allowed to look at it?
Well, what I was going to say is that we're quite comfortable for them to look at things like the systems that were employed to make decisions around school closures, border closures. But
so why does the terms of reference say that these unilateral decisions of the states are not in scope?
Well, what I'm saying is that I think remember, this is primarily an inquiry into the Commonwealth's role and the Commonwealth's handling. It's a Commonwealth inquiry, so it makes sense that primarily it's going to be the actions of the Commonwealth that are in focus. But we have also said that the responsibilities of states can be taken into account, and I think it would be perfectly fine for the inquiry to consider the systems that states had in place for deciding things like border closures, school closures. Right. But if we get to a point where the inquiry is looking into every decision that every state was made, this inquiry will never end. And what we want to do is have a good set of recommendations about how we can learn from the past, not engage in political point scoring, whether it be about the former federal government or Liberal and Labor state governments, but actually have practical recommendations that set us up for the future.
Just a final one in your capacity as Agriculture Minister. Overnight, China's Commerce Ministry has suggested a so-called package deal to drop the tariffs on Australian wine if we drop some of our anti-dumping approach on Chinese wind towers, railway wheels and stainless steel sinks. What's the Australian government's view on that package deal?
Well, we see these as entirely separate matters, David. Obviously, as a result of the great work of the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, the Trade Minister and others, we've been able to stabilise our relationship with China, and that is paying dividends for our farmers in areas like barley, horticulture, cotton and others. But wine remains an issue that we want to see resolved, and we've said all along to China that we'd like to see it resolved in the same way the barley dispute was resolved, through dialogue. But we will continue our case before the WTO about China's anti-dumping tariffs when it comes to wine. That trade was worth about $1 billion to Australia before those tariffs were imposed. It's down to about $16 million a year now.
That's
so it's important we have those lifted.
But the package deal, is it?
Yeah, no, we see them as entirely separate matters. We will continue our WTO case when it comes to wine, and we will continue to defend the case when it comes to steel. But we hope that all of these things can be resolved by dialogue.
All right, Murray Watt, appreciate your time this morning. Thank you.
Thanks, David.
The Minister is off to a March for Yes event there in Coolangatta for The Voice a little later this morning. Coming up, we are going to look at how the campaign for The Voice is tracking with just 3 weeks now to go until referendum day. Let's continue this, though, back with our panel. I'm joined once again by Samantha Maiden, Peter Hartcher and Dana Morse. Perhaps we should jump straight into this COVID inquiry issue. Just on that, Sam, is it clear that school closures will be looked at?
No, it's not. I mean, he's talking about process. Look, if the COVID inquiry is not going to look at the impact of school closures, I think that the Coalition, the Greens and the Independents should look towards establishing their own inquiry through parliamentary processes.
They'd have the numbers to do that.
Whether that's a Senate. Because when you talk to, I know this is not the only issue at all, but when you talk to teachers, and a lot of this is anecdotal and it needs to be teased out by experts and actual data, they tell you that there's behavioural issues around kids in kindy that they think may have been, a fallout from COVID. You've got to think about the impact on a generation of kids, particularly in Melbourne, that were locked down for long periods. There's kids in high school and early high school that have lost really important years that have contributed to them being behind where they should be. This is not something that you can deal with by having what Murray Watt was talking about, which was some sort of discussion of the processes. No, we need to talk about the impact on our children. That's a really important question. And how on earth, why on earth are we having it? A lot of these issues have already been canvassed very well, I must say, through some of the parliamentary processes, the COVID hearings that happened before the election, where they went into all of the stuff about supply chains.
This was the inquiry led by Katie Gallagher.
Yeah, and they had a lot of really great stuff.
A royal commission.
Yeah, that's right.
Look, there's this inquiry they have set up, just to explain, it's going to be led by 3 experts, an epidemiologist, an economist and a leading public health expert as well. And look, they will look at important things like job seeker, the vaccine rollout, whether we had enough stocks like masks and so on before the thing hit. But where you get to the most contentious issues around what the states did with lockdowns and border closures and school closures, this is a bit murky. I mean, some ministers are saying it's open to them to look at it, but have a look at the terms of reference. I mentioned this. It says, the following areas are not in scope for the inquiry: actions taken unilaterally by state and territory governments. Peter, that's pretty clear. Why is that in there, in the terms of reference?
Well, that's the $64 trillion question, isn't it? Look, the suspension of civil liberties of Australians during the pandemic was the greatest we've seen since World War II. We know there's going to be another pandemic. The epidemiologists who warned us that the last one was coming have told us that more will come. So we need to figure out whether the correct and proportionate suspension of civil rights, of human rights during that pandemic was fair,
justified,
reasonable and justified. But putting them, specifying that those unilateral decisions of the states, so vaccine mandates, movement restrictions, mask mandates, school closures, whether explicitly putting them outside the scope of the inquiry, I think is a huge missed opportunity for Australia to gauge that last episode and prepare for the next.
And they're striking out all of the major issues that actually really affected people's lives.
Yes.
That they're saying, oh, we won't talk about that. What?
And look, to be fair, a lot of these were difficult decisions states had to make on the fly, no doubt about it. One of the concerns, you heard it from Murray Watt there, is it would be too unwieldy to unpick all of this now. One of the other concerns I'm told is they don't really want to rev up all the cookers, the anti-vaxxers, those on both sides of the debate, the extremes on both sides of the debate. Some reckon we should all still be wearing masks and so on. Doesn't want to necessarily bring all of that back up to the surface again. Is that a fair argument, do you think, Dana?
I think when we start making decisions like this out of a basis of concern or fear about conspiracy theorists, that's bad governance. And I actually lived in 2 different states during the pandemic. I lived in South Australia under a Liberal Premier, under Stephen Marshall. I also lived in Melbourne under Dan Andrews. And there were very different decisions taken in those things and decisions that need to be thoroughly examined. The other interesting thing about this is Scott Morrison has said that he won't cooperate with an inquiry that doesn't examine the actions of the states and the territories. So what does that mean for him? Is he now off the hook for the role that he played because he's flagged this?
It's also a little unclear whether there will be public hearings or not as part of this. Look, the opposition leader clearly thinks this is designed to protect Labor states, Victoria and Queensland in particular.
It's clear that either the Prime Minister's been rolled here by Daniel Andrews and the Premier of Queensland, or the Prime Minister is just happy to make a mockery of his own words before the election.
Look, my understanding is those state premiers weren't actually asked whether they wanted a Royal Commission or whether this was a decision taken before it really got to them. The Prime Minister, by the way, is suggesting this will have the abilities that a Royal Commission would anyway.
No one promised a Royal Commission. I see the attempt by the coalition to somehow say that that's the case. What do you think a Royal Commission could do that this couldn't do? Nothing.
Well, Sam, it could
I don't know what he's laughing about. I mean, look, this is so aggravating, right? Because, look, he's right to say that he did that classic politician thing during the election where he gave himself wiggle room, right? He said, you know, we will have a Royal Commission or some other inquiry. And there was no doubt, you know, that there would no doubt be footage of some pesky reporter, you know, saying to him, was that a Royal Commission? You know, so he didn't, it's true that he didn't say, but he certainly gave people a good strong whiff of one. And as you said, Katie Gallagher, it was in the recommendations that they said there should be one. And I just think it's incredibly incurious because the Royal Commission into the robo-debt was fantastic and was just a very important piece of work and did affect, you know, quite wrongly tens of thousands of Australians. But this is something that affected far more than that. And the idea that you would have a Royal Commission into robo-debt, but somehow it's not important enough to have a Royal Commission into this is very curious.
On The Voice, mentioned earlier, another poll 3 weeks to go. The poll, Redbridge poll, has the yes support down to 38%. So they still have, well, an even bigger mountain to climb in the time that's left in this. One interesting thing, though, the Prime Minister pretty happy to see one prominent voter flip from no to yes, and that's Kamal, the famous singer. About a week ago was advocating a no vote. He was bagging the John Farnham ad and so on. He's then had a chat with people on the yes side, read apparently about Indigenous history, was shocked at what he found, and now he's advocating a yes vote. And Anthony Albanese's hoping that might inspire others to follow suit.
So we have now a new term that we've coined today, Kamalmentum, in the last couple of weeks. I would just encourage people to not be focused on what this isn't about, but be focused on what it is about.
Kamalmentum, Dana, what do you think? Is that going to be enough to turn it around?
Not on its own, certainly not on its own, but also it speaks to the counterfactual of what the No campaign has been all along, which is if you don't know, vote no. Well, if you do know, Kamal's obviously found that he's going to vote yes. So that's the task on their hands. That's been the task on their hands all the way through, in fairness, is getting this information, of which there is a lot, into user-friendly, bite-sized chunks for everyday Australians to consume. But the poll you're talking about as well also said this isn't in the top 5 issues for most Australian voters, which is what we would expect. Most Australian voters wouldn't be affected by The Voice as the government has proposed it. So it's not surprising that it's not a huge concern for them. But, you know, it is interesting that other figures say that 20 to 30% of Australians won't have made up their mind until they're standing in the queue to vote. I mean, that's where volunteers and people standing out in front of poll stations is going to have a huge effect on the vote.
Yeah, the yes side, Peter, have often said it'll be in the final 2 weeks that people pay attention, they turn this around. What do you think? Is it still possible for them to do that?
Well, if they can find another 5 million Kamals in 2 weeks, Yes, but that's obviously completely ridiculous. There's no sign, not one piece of evidence that the falling support for the voice has stabilised, much less turned around. So it's looking like an impossible task. It's looking consistent with all Australian history, that is that if there's a referendum question that is opposed by one side of politics, it will fail at the ballot box, worthy or not.
Yeah, well, the Prime Minister's doing apparently another event later today on The Voice where he's going to talk a little bit about what happens after a yes vote, if Australia does vote yes.
I think the other thing about the Kamal thing, which I noticed with two younger people I know, is that no one under the age of 30 knows who Kamal is. I had when I was talking about that story with people last week, I had two people under the age of 30 giggle and nervously say to me, "I've never heard of Kamal."
Why are people so unkind, Sam?
Exactly.
Josh Frydenberg, he's not seeking a return to Parliament at the next election anyway, doesn't rule it out down the track, but he's had a promotion at Goldman Sachs, chairman now of Goldman Sachs Australia and New Zealand, so he's going to be staying in the private sector. It does have implications, no doubt, for the Liberal Party. It makes it harder for them to win back that seat of Kooyong. You think Monique Ryan's now a stronger chance of holding on. I think it makes it harder for them in Victoria generally without Josh Frydenberg on the ticket, but helps Peter Dutton a little. Means, you know, us journos won't be running to Josh Frydenberg during the campaign and saying, you know, what do you think about everything Peter Dutton said, and finding differences between the two. And post-election means that option won't be there, Sam, for the Liberals to look to Josh. What do you make of what this all means?
Well, I think that there's lots of people who had always said, and no offence intended, that once Josh Frydenberg left Parliament and got into the private sector and started earning some serious coin, that it would be very hard to give that up, to return to the unpredictable life of being a political leader. But I mean, there's no doubt that he's very committed and very engaged in politics, and it was a difficult decision for him. But I think at the end of the day, having a job like that and having that time with family, and no doubt needing to travel, but having a little bit more flexibility and not having annoying journalists.
I suspect that flame still burns, though. I wouldn't be entirely surprised if
he could
this
come
is a
back
difficult
later.
period for the Libs, that after the next election, Peter, if there's a by-election opportunity or indeed...
He'll just hold out while they're in opposition and then come back and say, hold my beer.
Well, he's told people that he's discovered the precious gift of time with his kids, and he's got young kids. So maybe when they've aged a bit and he thinks the prospects are better, I think you're right. The flame does still burn with Josh. I think it burns pretty fiercely. So I think this is temporary. But you're also right to say, David, that while this makes life a bit easier for Peter Dutton, who currently has no compelling alternative leader, whereas if Josh were there, he would have a compelling alternative leader looming over his shoulder, it nonetheless makes it harder for the Liberal Party. And it makes it harder for the Liberal Party to win the next election on the basis that, you know, Scott Morrison effectively severed, made the Liberal Party unelectable by severing so many women and young people's votes from the party. And unless they come back, the Liberal Party can't win an election. Josh would offer a much better prospect of bringing some of those voters back than Peter Dutton could.
Yeah, it's the two of them actually, Peter Dutton and Josh Frydenberg, get on pretty well. Peter Dutton went and visited him yesterday, but there aren't too many well-known moderates, or you know, I'm sure Josh Frydenberg would call himself a centrist. But does the party end up looking more conservative without someone like him on the ticket, at least?
Yeah, absolutely it does. They are already quite hamstrung by the hard right of their party, and they've got the Junior Coalition Party that leans more to the right as well. You know, they're quite stuck there. I think you can't overstate, though, in Frydenberg's situation here, what a mess the Victorian Liberals are in at the moment, and attaching yourself to that brand at this time. I mean, why would you want to do all that work? Like, really? I think sometimes politicians...
Do you want to be in government?
Yeah, well...
There is that.
There's fat chance.
There is another issue that I want to touch on, and that's Canada's Justin Trudeau's accused India of killing a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil. This is a Sikh separatist. Narendra Modi outraged at the accusation. Diplomatic tensions have flared, but it's been fascinating to watch some of the Australian reaction to this as well, Peter, because it does create a bit of awkwardness, doesn't it? We're trying to get a lot closer to India, certainly Anthony Albanese and Modi. We've seen the two of them getting closer together, but what's India up to when it comes to pursuing these Sikh separatists?
In India itself, Modi has effectively shut down the Sikh independence, Sikh separatist movement, but it lives on in the Indian diaspora abroad, such as Canada and Australia. And in that case, obviously, where the Canadian government has accused Indian agents of committing murder on their soil, Australia's had to make a choice. Australia and all of the Western world is hoping to bring India further into the anti-China bloc, because India is the swing state between support for China, support for the West. India is really central. It's also central to whether we can successfully contain global temperatures, by the way. It's a swing factor in climate change. But on the other hand, there's Canada, and Justin Trudeau and the Five Eyes network have appealed to their allies in Five Eyes for assistance. So we know that Joe Biden and Anthony Albanese, as well as Justin Trudeau, have made privately to Modi representations saying, what's going on, this is wrong, don't do it. And Modi has taken huge offence with Canada. So, and he's now stopped, the Indian government has stopped processing Canadian visas, they've broken off free trade talks, and there'll be other repercussions as well. So this is the juggle now. So Albanese is committing big time to India, and yet at the same time taking what modest steps he thinks necessary to talk to Modi about addressing the problem.
Yeah, it's difficult terrain, but you know, if what Trudeau is saying is true, this is pretty serious stuff.
Well, we have some Sikh separatists operating in Australia too, so we have a direct interest there as well.
All right, our panel, Dana Morse, Peter Hartcher and Samantha Maiden, will be back very shortly with some final observations. Time now, though, for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with writer and producer, the one and only Zoe Norton-Lodge, and a very warm welcome.
Oh, well, thanks for having me, Mike. It's great to be back to talk pictures.
Zoe, they say where there's smoke, there's fire, but where there's climate change and El Nino, there's bound to be fire. The Bureau of Meteorology said it's here. Lovely Mark Knight, who's got the two cute little kids beating up on Earth here.
Yeah, and a tiny little cow, I think, be like, I can't watch.
I can't watch.
And I feel like this does reflect the Earth to me. Down on their luck, they've you know, had a tough life. He's like not his best self, right?
No,
that's kind of my understanding of Earth right now.
About to get his leg twisted off. Harry Bruce, it started already as the bomb formally declares El Nino weather event with the newspaper on fire.
I mean, that's just kind of accurate, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's not really even a joke there. That's just like, yeah, it's on fire already. It's September.
Polly Farmer, we're heading for net zero.
Emissions.
Places to live. It's one of those cartoons that just cuts right through.
I know.
And this is such a familiar scene.
It's
right?
it's like almost triggering to look at this. I'm like, this is what it felt like. Why are they so depressing today, Mike? Oh my God.
I'm sorry.
I came here to have a good time, talk some pictures, and now I'm just depressed.
It is a very clever Megan Herbert, the definitely not in danger Great Barrier Reef in action sheet, and it's colour by numbers here, which I think all the coral can just be bleach white, right? Number 7.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, having said that, things are so dire and bad. I think maybe we all just need to do some mindful colouring in about the end of the world. Maybe that's the only way through. Just block it out. Just do some mindful colouring in. Oh, this is brilliant though, isn't it? Yeah, gaslight yellow, emergency red, extinction orange, greenwash green, anxiety blue, approved charcoal and bleach white.
Yep, lovely David Pope. Penny travels heavy. She's got a lot of baggage.
I mean, she does, but like, I reckon you could probably fit a climate commitment in a little bit of carry-on.
Just a little teeny bag. That'll go under the seat. David Pope's got her arriving in New York. Welcome delegates to the UN General Assembly, and of all the trips for Qantas, not to lose our baggage.
I know, they would enjoy losing that baggage. It must be a burden, being like the world's ending and I've got to do something about it.
Peter Dutton's not known for pulling his punches, but this week he went nuclear. Zoe, lovely David Rowe, with the unicorn pulling the small modular reactor.
Yeah, like a beautiful children's story. Yeah.
the road to net zero. I love this. David Littleproud, and it's Ted O'Brien here, and Chris Bowen.
My favourite bit of talking pictures, I always feel so sorry for the people who have to have the name tag, Ted. Because it's like no one knows. And I'm glad you said Ted O'Brien, because I was like, I've got no idea who that is.
Warren Brown seems to think that Robert Oppenheimer never got over the fact that he inadvertently created Chris Bowen, as there's a fissile material going off here.
You'd be devastated. You're a physicist, you're doing all this important work, you get, assigned to a secret project you don't know is to create Chris Bowen. What a waste of your skills. You'd be devastated.
With less than 3 weeks to go to the voice referendum, both sides are trying to make themselves heard. And I did love the thought of the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese in a onesie, a yes onesie.
Well, that's a thought you love, and that's special for you. I'm glad.
Kathy Freeman, it's every second counts, Albo.
Yeah.
The frog and the scorpion. It's only on the no-ther side that we can really start talking about treaties or changing the date of Australia Day. Right, Peter?
Yes, and he's just like, sure, let me just nip at your little ears with my lovely scorpion claws.
John Kudelka's got all nostalgic for those wonderful COVID years.
I mean, I do enjoy this cartoon though, like setting the mood with the state borders closed. Because you know what I'm nostalgic for? COVID. I miss it. Wasn't that a great time? Yeah.
He's got Albo here in his containment suit. Thought it might set the mood as the COVID inquiry is crossing a state border here. It's lovely nostalgic. Took us right back to that wonderful years of locked up.
I miss it, just a lovely trip down memory lane when you couldn't go, interstate or down the street or see your mother, it was...
or exercise or... Yeah. It was just terrific.
We all miss it terribly.
It's been a pleasure unpicking the events this week. I'll let you do the honours.
Back to you, David.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, Mike. Time for some final observations. Quick one from me. Human trafficking, a review by Christine Nixon's due back this week. We're going to see a strike force apparently set up to go after dodgy employers who take advantage, exploit vulnerable workers, and some stronger legislative powers as well. So that'll be during the week. Dana.
The AEC have said that they have just sky-high levels of vitriol and things like death threats being sent through to staff. They're, trying to do their best with it, but it's pretty shocking that people are targeting electoral workers and volunteers. And of course, we've also seen sky-high calls to 13 Yarn, the Indigenous Mental Health Support Service. So referendum's taking its toll across the board.
Difficult few weeks ahead. Peter.
Well, after the Scott Morrison government stacked government boards with political mates, the Albanese government said it was going to depoliticise government boards and commissioned a report from Linnell Briggs, who was former Public Service Commissioner, former Royal Commissioner into Aged Care. I'm told that report was finished and handed to Katie Gallagher last month. So if the government is serious about depoliticising government boards, we need to see the report and see a government response.
There you go, Sam.
Remember when the Albanese government thought it was a great idea to junk 50 years of history and just stop publishing who was on VIP flights, where they flew, and the passenger manifest? And they said, don't worry about that. Don't worry your pretty little heads, because we are going to provide those passenger manifests to the independent watchdog on parliamentary expenses. Now, an interesting thing happened when I FOI'd that. No such documents exist. For some reason, the Defence Department has decided that politicians' travel, including Richard Marles, is so incredibly secret that even the independent watchdog on expenses can't see it. So it'll be interesting to see when they clear that up. They haven't handed over the documents now for either the entire term of the Albanese government, just about. So it'd be interesting to see whether they actually start doing it.
It will indeed. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Finally, Prime Ministers get to meet a lot of interesting people and see a lot of interesting things. Some they might rather forget. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
Look, as Prime Minister, you do get to meet some incredible people.
The Prime Minister was happy to hand over a cheque for $6 million to help sick kids as part of a telethon in Perth on the weekend. Anthony Albanese was made to wear his pyjamas.
That can't be unseen.
No.
And it was worse from the front. Let me tell you. And they gave us absolutely no warning whatsoever.
But nice to catch up with the Kazakhstani Prime Minister, isn't it?
That guy raised a lot of money for kids' charities. So.
Yeah, I saw his budget black hole earlier. And I don't...
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.